Hey, Curtis Fry with Fly Fish Food, and today we're gonna go through all the things that you need to know when it comes to buying a fly rod. Whether this is your first fly rod or your 50th, these are the things you wanna know.
Yeah, that's a big brown, bro.
All right, we have heard this comment so many times.
You don't need to spend $1,000 on a fly rod.
While that may be true, some people do like and don't mind spending $1,000 on a fly rod. But what should you look to? What are some of the considerations that you should consider when it comes to buying a fly rod? So let's start off with that specific one, and that is budget. Most of the other videos where we talk about things that are expensive or more expensive, budget is a big concern, right? So what we want to do is kind of go through what that means to you. Like, what are you getting if you spend more money on a rod? When it comes to your fly rod search, I would just say on the lower end or the upper end, whether you can only afford a couple $100 or you can afford $1,000 with no problem, buy what works for you. If you can't afford $1,000 rods, don't be dumping on them. They're all right. If you can buy $1,000 rods, don't be dissing the people who buy $200 rods. It's just fishing. So at the end of the day, I always recommend when somebody comes into the shop, what is your budget? That's the biggest driver, because if you're not up to spending $1,000 on a fly rod, great. We'll find a rod that works for you. The most important thing is that you get your butt out and fish. That was mean, but it is true. You need to get out there and fish. So the rod that you choose needs to fit your budget. Aside from that, and again, assuming for me, maybe spending $10 on a pack of hooks is the same as some dude that has way more money than I do. That's, to him, the $1,000 fly rod's the same as that pack of the hooks. It's all relative. So who cares what other people are buying? Buy what works best for you and what your budget will allow. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk about some real nitty gritty, what you need to consider when it comes to buying a fly rod. First off, biggest question, what are you gonna use this fly rod for? All right, and that primarily boils down to species. We'll talk about function in a minute, but at the end of the day, what are you going to be using it for? Is this going to be small stream little brook trout that are no bigger than 4 inches? Are you going to be going after Dorado down in Argentina or Bolivia? Are you going to be fishing for trout in lakes or trout in rivers? Are you fishing from a boat? Are you fishing from shore? So there's a lot of things that come into play when we're talking about the function of the rod, i.e. what it's going to be used for. So I would say if we're going to kind of go and boil everything down to like an average, a 9'5" weight is probably going to cover most bases. It could be used on small streams, it could be used on lakes, it could be used on ponds. So by far our top selling rods really out of all categories are going to be your 9'5" weights. So those are kind of the standards. Now, if you do have a 9'5" weight already and you're looking to expand, now when you're talking about functionality, you might want to consider a rod. Let's say you do small streams. So the function needs to be maybe not a very long rod. You probably want it to be lightweight. So that you may want to pull your view down a little bit to look at smaller weight rods. If you're unsure of what the weights mean, Google it up. But at a high level, the smaller the number, the smaller diameter and lighter weight rod that you're going to be dealing with. So 1, 2, 3 weight rods, you're probably going to be chasing smaller fish with, or you're going to be using them in like specific applications, such as a Euro nymphing rod, which are 2s and 3s. Now those are designed differently, so it's kind of apples and oranges when you're talking a standard, let's say 2-weight trout rod. Those are going to be very light, kind of a limited purpose. So functionality wise, that's a big consideration. Then we have to talk about, in addition to kind of that function, you're going to have to talk about what types of fish you're going to be catching. So if you're fishing in a very small stream, let's say, but the fish are large, you may not want a 2-weight. You may want a 5-weight. You may want a 6-weight. So my advice to you is buy every weight of every rod and you're set. But that is unrealistic. So don't do that unless you can afford it. My point is, you got to narrow down your choices based on what you're going to be doing. So just to kind of paint a wide brushed picture here. Small stream, small fish, small weight rod. Large bodies of water with large fish and large flies, larger weight rod. So that's kind of the ends of the spectrum. And then you just kind of ferret it out in between that. The biggest resource, I would say, depending where you're going to be fishing, you could always ask a buddy or a local fly shop what they recommend for the type of rod for that area. Notice I haven't talked about budget. Most of the rods that you find in different manufacturers are going to have different budget ranges. So you might find a lower end Echo rod that has, like a 3-weight that's going to work great on small streams. You're only paying a couple $100. You could also spend $1,000 for that exact same type of rod, that same type of application, if you were to buy like a Sage R8 or an Orvis Helios. Again, budget, we've talked about, so we're talking strictly about functionality. And so ask around if you're maybe going to limit your fishing to one type of body water or maybe a smaller range. Now, if you were to say, oh, I really like to fish these small streams with small brook trout, so a 2 or 3-weight might be good. But then I'm going to go down to the coast and fish for something, bonefish in the flats. Okay, you're not going to be using a 3-weight for that. And I wouldn't recommend it. So again, you're talking different functionalities for different types of rods. So use that to kind of dial in the weight of the rod and maybe the type of the rod. And that will help you, once you've ascertained your budget and you kind of know the type of rod that you're going to need based on the function, then that helps kind of narrow down the possibilities. Okay, another thing that would determine the weight rod to get would be the fly size. As an example, I really like to fish for bass. A lot of the smallmouth bass around here are not very big. Now, we do have some bigger ones, but I'm probably throwing much larger flies to a smallmouth bass than I am for a trout. So if I'm throwing a big crawdad, heavy-weighted kind of streamer fly, I probably don't want to throw that with my 5 or even my 6-weight. So if I'm going to go throw after bass, even though the bass are maybe even smaller than the trout in the same body of water, I'll probably be picking up an 8-weight. Or if I'm fishing for carp, a 5-weight would certainly work, and the carp are going to eat these little teeny flies. But if I hook into a 20-pound carp, that 3-weight's not going to cut it, or that 5-weight probably won't cut it. Meaning it's going to put tons of stress, it's going to be much harder to deal with the fish. And so I would tend to look at the fish size and the fly size as you determine the weight rod that you need. Okay, so that's very important. Not one weight rod is going to cover all conditions. Now, if you're just, I'm going to go to this tailwater and this is the only place I go and the fish max out at 20 inches, your 5-weight 9-foot rod will be great. And if you only paid $50 for it, no problem. Okay, so figuring the function and kind of where and how you're going to be using the rod determines the weight. And that's probably the biggest factor when it comes to buying a rod. All right, another consideration related to function and kind of how you're going to be using the rod is going to be the length of the rod. An average fly rod is 9 feet in length, and that's been kind of an average for a lot of years. Now you're going to see in a given rod model, like let's talk about the Orvis Helios that just barely came out a little bit ago. You've got a whole slew of different weights, but in a whole slew of different lengths as well. So I could get a 5-weight and an 8.5. I get it in a 9. I get it in a 10. 9.5. I can get it in a 10. Anyway, from what I remember. So even a given weight rod is going to come in different lengths. So why the heck do you need a different length of rod? Well, first and foremost, there's a number of reasons, and a lot of it can also go back to personal feel. I like longer rods. I like the way they cast. I like the way they load. More leverage for picking line up off the water. If I'm fishing from a boat or from shore where I'm not like right there on the water, it's also helpful. Again, that extra length. Now, if I'm fishing on a little brushy creek that doesn't have a whole lot of overhead or backcast room, sometimes, not always, it is better to have a shorter rod. So like a 7.5, 8.5 footer, those are great. Like one of my favorites would be, say, a Winston 8.5 foot 4-weight or 3-weight, 7.5 foot 3-weight. So those are perfect for small stream. Now what that is that's a functional thing. Like if I want to dial in the best tool, let's say for a given type of fishing that I would do, I'm going to look at the weight and the length of the rod. And so normally most of my rods are going to be kind of categorized that way. So I've got my small stream stuff, which is going to be smaller weights, lower lengths. But I also will have some, like if I'm Euro nymphing, 10 foot, 10.5 foot, 3-weight, 2-weight. So to summarize length, you want to have rods that fit in the function that you're doing, but also the weight. So what that means is I'll typically have, at least in the rods that I own, I may have smaller weights, smaller lengths. I may have larger weights, larger lengths, but I also have smaller weights, larger lengths. So like a 10 foot 2 weight. I even have a 10-foot 1 weight. So again, length, there's a lot of functionality built into length, but as well as like I mentioned, tight cover and different scenarios that you need to pay attention to with length. The other thing that length will impact, and could be a big one for some people, if you're going to backpack, you may want a shorter rod that breaks into, say, still 4 pieces, but if it's a shorter rod, it's going to inherently be a little shorter overall that will fit better into a backpack. There are also some rods that come into 6-piece lengths, like the Orvis Clearwater has a 5 weight that has a 6-piece option. People love that for backpacking. Now, that also brings up another point when it comes to selecting a rod. You may need a rod that's kind of a jack of all trades. And so in that scenario, let's say you are going on a backpacking trip, or you're going to be heading off and fishing a variety of waters but don't have a lot of luggage room to pack 4 or 5 rods, then I'd probably start to look at kind of finding an average. And so a 4 or 5 weight may be better for you in those types of scenarios when you're thinking of weight and length. Okay, so beyond those kind of core functional length and weight issues, let's talk about some of the other considerations that you may not have thought about. The first one, and this is a very nebulous term, and that is the fly rod action. Now, by action, what we typically mean is the amount, just to put it in terms of a 4th grader, it's amount of bendiness and wiggliness that the fly rod will have. More specifically, it's going to be how that rod reacts under load as it's loading the fly rod to cast your fly, and how it reacts after the load is delivered. In other words, how long is it sitting there flapping in the wind before it settles down and allows you to do your job. So something that tends to load quickly and unload quickly and settle down quickly, I would say that's a fast action rod. Fast action rods tend to be a little bit more expensive. Not always, but that's kind of the trend these days. I personally typically prefer a fast action rod for most of my fishing. However, and this is a good example, if you look at, say, a Winston, when I first started fishing Winstons 20 years ago, first time I fished one, I didn't like it because I had been used to faster rods. I was in college and I had enough money for basically one rod that I used, and it happened to be a really fast action Sage rod. And when I went to cast a Winston, I was like, oh, it felt so sluggish and slow. But as I got better at casting, I realized that that was designed specifically for that scenario, and that is light flies, light tippets, maybe not the biggest fish in the world, but you certainly could, and a more, let's call it, pleasurable experience casting. So one of my favorite things to do is grab one of these lightweight, dry fly specific rods and take it out and fish for dries. Now, could I catch fish on that same type of stream with a 5 weight rod? Absolutely. And if that's what you want to do, go for it. What I have found is that as I've gotten kind of expanded my arsenal of fly rods, I start to dial in fly rods based on action. And so Winston's or some of these other rods, so like the Sage LL, I've had one of those for a lot of years, and I just got one a couple of years back. And those things are great, but they're lighter, little bit slower action rods. Now, one of the things when it comes to action, I would say, and this is a little counterintuitive, and this is my experience, my opinion, but I have found that a faster action rod, i.e. Lankley, a more expensive rod, is going to be a little easier for beginners to learn. So if you're getting into the sport and want to learn to cast and don't want to spend a lot of money on a faster action rod, go borrow one from somebody or go to your local fly shop and say, hey, can you let me cast this? So you can at least get a feel for how it is. So don't always feel that you have to own or buy one. You can always borrow or test. So the action is also a personal preference. I know a lot of people that really hate fast action rods, and to each their own. I know a lot of people just don't like the slower action rods. And so for the most part, the lower end rods, meaning lower price rods, are probably going to be made with a lower modulus graphite. And I'm only talking graphite here. If we were talking bamboo or fiberglass, it'd be a little bit different conversation, so we're going to leave that out. But fiberglass, lower modulus, meaning it's not as stiff, so it can bend a little bit more, and the way it's built and the taper and the design is going to be a little bit wigglier. I don't even know if that's a word, but that's one of the things to see. Now, that also brings up a whole, let's call it kind of category of rods. I say your entry level, kind of lower end price, higher end price, which is what these guys are going to be here, your Winston, Sages, Orvis, G. Loomis, Asquith, NRX, that kind of thing. But you do have a great selection of mid-range rods that I would say are still fast and they're well designed, but they don't have that $1,000 price tag. So things like this, one of my favorite of those rods is the Orvis Recon. The G. Loomis also has a mid-range rod. Echo has some good mid-range rods in that price range. Lamson has some great rods for those great prices. So don't think that if you're paying a little lower price that you're getting the lower end of the spectrum. In a lot of cases, these mid-range rods were at one point the granddaddy of the lineup of a model, and they've kind of done a hand-me-down sort of thing. Maybe not the exact design, but there are remnants of that. So that's one advantage if you were to buy a mid-range price rod, which might be a mid-action rod from one of the more expensive brands. You're kind of buying an upper-end rod at a lower price. It's almost a sale if you think of it like that. So anyway, action is one of the things that you may want to feel. And I would say really the best way to get a gauge on the action, because it's relative to you in a way, and that is go out and cast one. So go to your local fly shop, test cast it, see what you think. Make sure that the line they put on that is going to match what you would use it for. So if you're going to go out and throw big streamers with a 5-weight or a 6-weight, make sure that you can at least try to cast that with a line like a Scientific Anglers MPX or any of those other lines that are a little heavier, beefier tapers to help turn over bigger flies. And I would say that any test casting you do, try to at least cast with a fly on there. You need some weight because that's what really completes the equation of what you're going to be seeing out in the wild when you're actually using this rod. So again, action is good. Look at the fast action rods, tend to be more expensive. Lower end rods tend to be slower, going to take a little bit more time to kind of adjust and get your cast down, but they will work. They'll certainly catch fish. But regardless of what you do, I'd probably say get out and test cast if you can. Now, there are some rods that I will just buy without test casting because I know, let's say like an Orvis Helios lineup, I've cast the previous ones, I love them. If they were to come out with a new one tomorrow, I'd buy it because I do like it. I know the rod designer, and I know how the rods are built. So I do have some confidence at least, and I tend to test cast these regardless, but once you get it to a brand that you like, it's often safe to stay with that brand because they're going to, within maybe some variations of how the tapers are built with the different lengths and weights, there will be some differences, but by and large, you're looking at a good quality rod. If you feel confident in it, stick with it. All right, so that brings up another point, and that I think is one that gets a fair bit of coverage, but probably not enough, and that is the warranty. So if you buy a fly rod, you can expect that there's always a possibility that it will break, whether you break it or it breaks on its own. Fly rods will break. The thing that you want to consider is how quickly can you get that fly rod repaired or replaced and back in your hands to catch more fish. Fly rods bought overseas tend to not have the best way to service a warranty. They may ship spare parts to the dealer, but if the dealer is Timmy's in the bottom of his house basement fly shop online and he goes to Alibaba and he finds a bunch of fly rods to sell with an 80% markup, and you break one of those fancy Timmy super rods, you may not ever see that rod again if you send it in. Now, this is just speaking in generalities, but when you buy a rod from a company that's well established, even if you've heard of horror stories, everybody shares, oh, I'm never buying a rod from them because their customer service sucks. Remember, that's one experience from one person. We've worked with all these companies. We've worked with our customers working with these companies. I would say any of the companies that we list, and we're going to list a lot of these rods below, they are going to be reliable and dependable. And if you do run into issues with anything, let us know. We'll see if we can help hurry things along if you run into issues and snags. But honestly, we don't hear that much. When we have people buy from us, we may hear, oh, well, it took a little bit longer to get the rod back. But warranty is a big deal. If you're buying an off-brand rod, you can expect a warranty is not going to be as ironclad and quick to return, especially if it has to go overseas. So that's a consideration. If you spend a $200 fly rod and it's done, then you may have well just spent a $400 fly rod or spent money on a $400 fly rod. So that's one aspect. I always like to look at those warranties to see how they work. One of the things I would just call out Orvis because this is a phenomenal thing that Orvis has done. Their fly rods are built in such a way that a piece of a fly rod will work with any, or you could take your 9-foot 5-weight, let's say you broke the tip section, they will send you another tip section and it will work with that rod. A lot of the other rods, when they're constructed, they have to align them properly because they're built on the same, it's a full blank that's been cut. And that if this piece doesn't match this piece, no worky. So Oris has done a great job at creating interchangeable parts, which is like one of the tenets of basic manufacturing. Very difficult with fly rods because they are kind of an artisanal product. And so there's some craftsmanship there, but I think that strikes a great balance. But any other main brands here, they are great with warranty. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer, but don't forget about a warranty. I would take that in consideration and use that when you go to buy your fly rod. Okay, one final thing, and this is just kind of dumb, but I will mention it because we see this come up quite a bit, and that is the look of the fly rod. Now, Winston, very, very famous for their classic green. A lot of people like that, and I know people that buy Winstons because they like the color better than some of the other rods. Similar price, similar function, right? So I'm not going to go out and just buy a blue fly rod because it looks cool. It needs to also fit the most important criteria. But I wouldn't be afraid to buy based on color or probably more than that brand. I have found if you feel confident with the brand, like I mentioned, roll with it. They're going to always, typically if they're a well-established company, they're going to be coming out with more models, more line weights and lengths, so more functionality. So if you're into, say, Stillwater and your current rod manufacturer doesn't have a 10-foot 6-weight, which is our favorite toy for Stillwater, tool, let's call it, then maybe your brand will at some point have a rod that fits that functionality. So again, brand and look and feel is also an important factor for a lot of people. Anyway, to summarize, when it comes to buying a rod, let me recount. Do what your budget allows. Budget's relative. Don't shame the guy who spends $1,000 on a rod. Conversely, if the person can only spend $200 on a rod, so what? Buy what you can buy. Who cares what other people buy? Buy what's best for you, what you can do. Look at the length. Look at the weight as far as functionality and what you're going to be doing, where you're going to be fishing, whether they have backcast concerns or anything like that. And then, again, you're going to be looking at the warranties and things like that to help you know which one to buy. If you have any other questions or some considerations, drop them in the comments below. Check out our website, flyfishfood.com. Thanks for seeing this and stay tuned for our next one. Like and subscribe.